Hi, I'm Rob, and I'd like to welcome you to this video where we'll take the RAG pipeline from the last video in the playlist and turn it into a real app using Streamlit, OpenAI, and ChromaDB to get answers to our queries plus the source chunks. So let's jump into the code and get started. First, I want to point out the README, which lists some prereqs you'll need and specifically an OpenAI API key. So if you don't have one yet, head on over to platform.openai.com/API-keys, sign up, then follow the docs to create your key. You'll need to put it in the .env file in the demo folder, as we'll see shortly. Under the prereqs, you'll see the setup and run sections. Go ahead and follow those steps after you clone the repo, and you'll be all set to follow along here. Now, before we jump into the code, I want to point out a markdown file in the data folder. This has information for a fictitious company named AI Agent Ensure that we'll use as a data source for our RAG app. Now, in the project folder, I want to point out two more files. The first is the .env.example file, which you should copy and save as .env, then add your OpenAI API key as you see here. The other is the requirements.txt file, which will be used by pip install to install the dependencies required for the app. And finally, we'll open the app.py file for the application. Now, looking at this application, it should look pretty familiar if you followed along with the prior video in the playlist. First, we'll import our dependencies. The difference in this app being Streamlit. We'll load the .env file to get our OpenAI API key. We'll create the path to the data directory, set the top K to 8, which, as we saw in the prior video, worked well when retrieving data from the AI Agent Ensure markdown file, which is loaded into the vector store. Select the embedding model and the chat model. Here we have a load documents function, which will load and concatenate any markdown files in the data folder, which in our case we only have one, and a chunk by sentences function, which takes a document and returns that document content in chunks. The build index function builds and returns a ChromaDB collection, which is the searchable index in our app, an instance of an OpenAI client, and a list of text chunks. It gets the chunks by passing the doc, which was returned from load documents, to the chunk by sentences function. Then we'll call create on embeddings of the OpenAI client, passing the embedding model and the chunks to get the embeddings. Then we'll take the response data and use it to get the embeddings, which we'll store here. Then we'll get IDs for each chunk. We'll create a ChromaDB client and a collection and add the IDs, the embeddings, and the document chunks to the collection, and again return these values. On line 38, before the build index function, we see a Streamlit decorator that runs the build index function once and caches the result for the entire session. The answer from context function takes a context, a question, and a client, builds a prompt telling the model to only follow the context to answer the question, and if the context doesn't contain the answer, say no. We inject the context and the question, and then build the answer by calling create on the chat completions API, setting the message to the role of user and the content equal to the prompt, and then we'll return the result. Now in the main function, we primarily have our Streamlit code, which we'll use to set the page configuration for the page title and an icon, set the title on the page and a caption. Then we'll try to call build index, which will return our ChromaDB collection, the OpenAI client, and all the chunks. We'll populate the sidebar on the page with the length of all the chunks returned, and then populate a question variable, which is equal to the value of a text input field. And when the ask button is clicked, we'll show a spinner and then execute code to create the embeddings and the vector store. Then call query on the collection, setting the query embeddings and the top K. We'll retrieve the document and the IDs, then set the context, then call the answer from context function, passing the context the question, and the client. When we get the answer, we'll populate it on the page. And when the expander is clicked, we'll show the document chunks. So let's jump into a terminal, change into our project directory. Then if we go back to the README and follow the setup steps, first you'll create your virtual environment, which I've already done. So I'll go ahead and activate it. Then run the uv pip install command to install the libraries, which I've already done, but I'll go ahead and do it again. And then make sure you copy the .env example to .env and add your OpenAI API key. And then finally run the Streamlit run command, passing it the app.py file. And with the page loaded, we see we have 34 chunks that were indexed in the ChromaDB vector store, that we're using sentence chunking with top K set to 8, and we can ask a question. I'll click the Ask button. And we see the answer and the source chunks. Now let's go back up to the top and we'll grab one of these coverages and ask what that coverage is. And we see the results and the chunks. And let's try one more question. That's not in the vector store. And we get a response back that the context does not contain the answer to the question. And let's take a look at the retrieved chunks. Which obviously don't contain any information on the 2025 Formula One Constructors Championship. So that concludes this video walkthrough on building a Streamlit app on top of a RAG pipeline using OpenAI and ChromaDB. If you found it interesting, feel free to give it a like. And if you'd like to be notified when I add more content to the channel, please consider subscribing. Thanks for watching.